Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Nerdscape, where we will continue our journey through the Harry Potter universe, going chapter by chapter. My name is Michael, and today we are going to analyze chapters 6 through 9 of the Sorcerer's Stone. Guys, these chapters are amazing. Each one establishes at least one thing that is going to continue through all 7 books, as well as introducing the main setting of our story, Hogwarts. But before I can get into any of that, I have to give you a spoiler warning. We will be talking about all published books in the Harry Potter universe. Further, I might talk about Cursed Child, the Fantastic Beasts movies, including the most recent one, and anything on Pottermore that might be listed that could pertain to our discussion. So, if you don't want to be spoiled, I suggest you click off now, catch up with the series, and come back. Although, even if you do, thank you for watching. Now, how did Harry spend the last bit of his month inside the Muggle world? Well, he spent it mostly alone. You see, Dudley was too afraid to spend any amount of time in the same room with Harry, and his aunt and uncle had decided that, after the events of Chapter 4, the best course of action was to ignore his existence entirely. Harry wasn't put off too much by this. Obviously, this is better than the Dursleys constantly bullying him, but this did leave a general tone of depression in the house. Therefore, Harry spent the majority of August 1991 inside of his room studying anything he could about the Wizarding World. So he studied his course books and history books, all getting him ready for his first year at Hogwarts. He had decided, for example, to name the owl that Hagrid had gotten for his birthday Hedwig, a name he had picked out of History of Magic. It's unclear exactly where in the history book this name comes from, although given the fact that Hedwig is a German name, it's probable that Hedwig is most likely just named after a prominent German witch who made some sort of name for herself. Maybe if the writers are smart, inside the Fantastic Beasts movies we might get an Easter egg. But on August 31st, Harry does decide finally he needs to ask his aunt and uncle for a ride to the station. Interestingly though, both Vernon and Petunia scoff about the idea of Platform 9 3/4. However, we know from the Prince's Tale chapter in Deathly Hallows that Petunia was actually on the platform with Lily during Lily's first year of attendance at Hogwarts. Now, granted, Petunia would have only been 13 when Lily went to school for the first time, and it is likely that that was the only time that Petunia accompanied Lily to the platform, but she should still remember what Platform 9 3/4 is. Now, I completely buy the fact that Petunia would be vindictive and not tell Harry how to get on the platform, but her reaction in this chapter is a little bit too genuine for me to believe that. This is most likely just a minor plot hole because JK hadn't thought up every little point of the Snape reveal yet, and it's just a fun little note. Speaking of fun little notes, the only reason the Dursleys say that they're going to take Harry to the platform is because they have to take Dudley to a doctor's appointment in London, and it's along the way. This is just so that we can get rid of the tale, and it does become a plot point later on when the Dursleys come back in the story. But at 10:30 the next morning, Harry arrives at King's Cross Station between platforms 9 and 10, and the Dursleys promptly abandon him. And thankfully, this story abandons the Dursleys until Chamber of Secrets because I'm pretty exhausted of them. Unfortunately, though, Hagrid had never told Harry how to get on the platform or even exactly where it is, and he's running out of time. At one point, he even gets desperate enough to ask the Muggle worker about the train that leaves at 11 or where platform 9 3/4 is. Now, of course, this Muggle worker has no idea what Harry is talking about and just gets irritated at this Karen Harry for wasting his time. If there was only a group of lovable redheads that Harry could attach himself to that could help him along his path. Yes, of course. Yes, Harry manages to run into what later know to be Molly Weasley, marching her flock of children onto the platform. Harry overhears a lot of great one-liners like the infamous, "I'm not Fred, I'm George, honestly, Mother." And we get introduced to Ron, Percy, Fred, and George, as well as briefly getting introduced to Molly and Ginny. They help Harry onto the platform, and I think it's a kind of an interesting, fun little theory here that the reason that Molly was saying things like, what was the platform number again? When she has no reason to say these things. I mean, she has so many children, and she herself went to Hogwarts. She knows what the platform number is. It's a fun little theory that Dumbledore actually wrote Molly and said, hey, Harry might be on the platform. Can you, say some things to get his attention, help him on? Now, I don't particularly subscribe to that theory because it's very arbitrary, and there's no guarantee that Harry would have overheard this conversation. But I do think it's a fun little idea, and I do like the idea of Dumbledore overlooking Harry's welfare at this point. But yeah, Harry gets on the platform, and we get introduced, at least by quick glimpses, some characters that we'll see for the rest of the story. Obviously, we get Neville Longbottom and his toad with his grandma, and we get Lee Jordan, who is entertaining a group of students. On a side note, Lee apparently has brought a giant tarantula to the school with him. Like, what? Okay, Lee, you do you, man. But I'm just letting you know, the last person who brought a giant arachnid into this castle, he got kicked out. So, mind your P's and Q's. Harry loads his belongings onto the train, and Fred and George help him do so. Also, Fred and George get a lot of flack for being unreasonably mean, especially to Ron. And there are times when their jokes go a little bit too far, or they get a little bit too mean. But also keep in mind that Fred and George helped a random first year load his belongings onto the train. They didn't have to do that. And I'm just saying, next time they blow up a toilet, cut them some slack. Harry, once he gets on the train, manages to overhear the Weasleys goodbye to each other. Fred and George had realized that Harry was Harry when they were helping him, and they tell Molly, oh, hey, we met Harry Potter. That's the boy that we helped onto the platform. Now, I do want to point out that in these group of chapters, we get a lot of personalized interactions between Harry and other students his own age that react to his notoriety. It's not super important, but it does cement Harry being famous. Now, Molly is an amazing person, and she cements that even here. She orders all of her children to never bring up Voldemort to Harry unprompted, and that's very sweet. On top of that, when Jenny says she wants to go have a look at Harry, which, by the way, Jenny, just give it a couple of years. You'll have plenty of time. Don't worry about it. Molly tells Jenny that, hey, he's not a zoo animal. Cut him some slack. He doesn't need that kind of attention. And a lot of adult witches and wizards can't even give Harry that space, and it's very motherly and very lovely. Also, finally, we get introduced to Percy the Prefect, where prefects are introduced as a concept inside the castle. But the Hogwarts Express departs the station, and Ron enters the compartment. And here we get the establishment of the best friendship and bond that Harry ever has. And really, I think it's one of the best in the entire series. A lot of people give Ron a lot of flack in the fandom for being temperamental and insecure with his friendship with Harry. And on top of that, people say that he doesn't offer a whole lot in comparison to Harry and Hermione in the Golden Trio. And while I do understand that that's a lot of his characters being insecure, and it's very valid to point that out, I think we're supposed to contrast the good things about Ron against that. For example, next year in Chamber of Secrets, who goes to save Harry from the Dursleys? Ron. In Deathly Hallows, when Harry is drowning in a frozen lake, who goes to save his best friend? No question. Ron. And all of these things, I think, are second to the fact that Ron represents Harry's first real friendship and brotherhood in this world. Ron always is a shoulder for Harry to lean on. And, well, yes, Hermione is very good at emotional therapy, so to speak. Ron is very much more comfortable. He's always there for a good laugh, and Harry never has to be afraid of judgment from him. I think that's very important. But before we can get into any of that, we have to actually establish that friendship here in the car. Harry tells Ron that he has no idea, or no memory at least, of Voldemort. He has no idea about the Wizarding World in general, and generally speaking, he puts his general lack of self-esteem on display. Now, Ron also suffers from a lack of self-esteem, and so that helps Ron open up to Harry. And Ron tells Harry that he has a very large amount of siblings who have all established themselves as very popular or very successful at Hogwarts. His eldest brother Bill was head boy. His second eldest Charlie was the Quidditch captain. Percy is a prefect on his way to become head boy. And the twins, Ron says, generally get pretty good marks on all their exams. We also get a nice little piece of world building here where Ron explains to Harry about what wizards and witches can do once they graduate Hogwarts. He says that Bill works for Gringotts in Africa, specifically Egypt, and Charlie works for Romania taming dragons. And of course, the series ends when Harry is 17, so we never actually get, Harry going to a job interview, but it is a nice little piece of world building. Harry explains to Ron, who Ron and Harry both think that each other are equally fascinating. Harry explains to Ron that all he remembers about the night his parents died is a flash of green light. Of course, on reread, we know this to be Avada Kedavra. However, Ron is the only person that Harry ever tells this to for until book 4, and Ron is not the most studious person in the world, so he has no basis to understand what this means. This keeps the audience in the dark and adds a little bit of air of mystery to the whole event. We also get the reveal here that Gringotts was broken into. Ron says that the Ministry always launches a major large-scale investigation when this kind of thing happens, on the off chance that it could be Voldemort. I find this very interesting because come Order of the Phoenix, when all these weird things are happening, Azkaban is being broken into, prefects are dying, so many weird things are happening on Ministry grounds, and Fudge still refuses to even kind of think it's Voldemort. But 4 years previous to that, when a relatively low security vault gets broken into, they immediately launch an investigation just on the off chance it's Voldemort. I don't know. It really just goes to show that Fudge was really losing it in that book. Next, we get the very sweet, no pun intended, moment where Harry buys a bunch of candy and sweets from the trolley lady and shares them with Ron. Also, the trolley lady does not grow claws in an attempt to stop any student from leaving the Hogwarts Express, so at least this year is safer than others, I guess. We get a lot of staples of food in these chapters, and specifically here we get the every flavor beans, and important to our plot, we get chocolate frogs. When Harry gets his chocolate frog collecting card, he gets Dumbledore, where we get a brief explanation that Dumbledore is famous for a bunch of things. He is famous for his defeat of Grindelwald, which, okay, I know you guys all want to hear me talk about Grindelwald. I'll get to it when it becomes relevant, come book 7, or if I do a Fantastic Beasts video. Just give me time, we'll get there. But he's also famous for the 12 uses of dragon blood and his work in alchemy with Nicholas Flamel. Of course, come Christmas time, when the trio is working very hard on the research into Nicholas Flamel after Hagrid lets him name drop, Harry forgets this, but it's a fun little aha moment for attentive readers. Scabbers, who is definitely Scabbers and nobody else, please stop asking, is also present. Ron tries a simple spell to turn him yellow for some flair, which does nothing, but upon this, the one and only know-it-all of Hogwarts arrives in the compartment. Hermione Granger. A lot of people forget that Harry, and especially Ron, were kind of the worst to Hermione. Now, to be fair, Hermione is a very large personality. She tells the boys that she's memorized all of their course books and has done a lot of additional research about the world at large, because she's Muggle-born, of course. However, Hermione is also nearly a year older than everybody else in her year. Her birthday is September 19th, meaning that she got her acceptance letter to Hogwarts nearly a whole year before anybody else did, which also means that she was able to go get her course books and everything else that she needed for school pretty much a year before anybody else, giving her a lot of time to be anxious and just generally curious about her studies. Also, Hermione is a know-it-all. I mean, she does want to know it all. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Hermione saves Harry and Ron's lives about 69,420 times. So we're going to pick our battles and not be mad at Hermione for, sometimes wanting to get a question right in class. And as such, we will say that it is very rude of Ron to say that he doesn't want to end up in the same Hogwarts house as Hermione. Which, Ron, give us 7 books, man. You'll end up in the same house. Just don't worry about it. Finally, the last major interaction of this chapter is with Draco Malfoy and his goons Crabbe and Goyle. Last episode, I said that Draco and Harry's interaction in Madame Malkin's was not the official line in the sand between the two boys. This interaction on the Hogwarts Express, though, is. Malfoy manages to insult both Hagrid and the Weasleys in probably 2 minutes of conversation, which leaves a bad taste in Harry's mouth. He being Draco, also manages to warn Harry not to interact with riffraff or it'll get him in trouble. The riffraff he is referring to are Muggleborns, blood traders, and half-breeds, all of which the Malfoy family are pretty famous about thinking that they're better than. I do find it an interesting idea, though, that Lucius Malfoy could have put Draco up to this. After all, Snape and even Voldemort later say that a lot of Death Eaters in the Dark Order's following thought that Harry would be a pretty good rallying point if it turned out that Harry was a Dark Lord also. I do think it's very likely that Lucius told Draco to get in Harry's good graces, because Lucius's claim to fame mostly is just giving money to the right people and kissing ass to the right people, so he has a nice claim to everything. Thankfully, though, Harry does none of this, and he pretty much cements the fact that Draco and him are going to be enemies for the entire career at Hogwarts. This is also a pretty good reflection of the James and Sirius versus Snape interaction that we know happens from the Princess Tale chapter. Everything comes full circle. It's a nice little callback. And also, after Malfoy leaves, Ron tells Harry that according to Mr. Weasley, the Malfoys all were very big supporters of Voldemort, and when Voldemort fell, they claimed to be bewitched by him. Of course, we know that what they actually mean. Of course, we know what this actually means is that they were under the Imperius Curse, which none of this gets established or expanded upon until Goblet of Fire, but it's still pretty good establishment for antagonists later on. The boys change into their school robes and they arrive in Hogsmeade Station, where Hagrid corrals the first years for their movement into the school. One thing I usually forget about is the first years actually go underneath the school and arrive in a nice little boat dock. This boat dock never comes up again, and I'm pretty sure we never go back to it at any point. But it's something that we should know to be on Hogwarts grounds, and maybe you can explore it when you play Hogwarts Legacy later this year. But with that, we enter into Chapter 7, the sorting. Hagrid passes the first years off to Professor McGonagall, who Harry describes as a very stern-looking witch. Professor McGonagall explains to the first years that they will be sorted into one of 4 houses, those houses being Gryffindor, Slytherin, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw. And also explains that they will attend classes with their housemates, while also, based on their behavior, acquiring or losing points that will all be tallied for the Hogwarts Cup at the end of the year. She then leaves them briefly, giving the students a moment to anxiously ponder what the sorting is actually going to be. According to Ron, the twins had told him that they have to wrestle a mountain troll or something. I don't know, it's pretty weird. I do find it weird that none of the first years know what the sorting is, because a lot of them grew up in wizarding families. Why doesn't Malfoy know what it is, or why doesn't Ron know what it is? There's a very popular, or at least semi-popular theory that the sorting process actually has a Fidelius charm placed on it, and nobody can actually reveal what the sorting is until you get to Hogwarts. I don't know, it's pretty interesting. I don't really know if I subscribe to that. I guess that's the only reason we can really give to explain why these first year, wizarding students have no idea what the sorting is, but it's pretty fun. And Hermione, I'm not saying no, Hermione doesn't mention that she knows anything about it, which is also weird because you'd think it would be in Hogwarts of history or something to that effect. I don't know. Either way, it's pretty fun. Also, we get the establishment of ghosts here, and that we get introduced to the Fat Friar and Nearly Headless Nick. Ghosts are always very fun in the Harry Potter universe, and they never get used a whole lot when it comes to the plot, but they are present, and they're very nice background world-building things, and I do enjoy that. Now, McGonagall returns and walks the first years into the Great Hall. The Great Hall is probably the most ambient thing at Hogwarts, and when you think of Hogwarts, you almost usually first think about the Great Hall. Harry explains it as very strange, yet very fun. There are 4 very long house tables where all the students are sitting. At the front of the hall, there is a staff table with all the teachers, and the ceiling is bewitched to reflect the outside sky, which gives the entire room a very ambient feeling. Now here the sorting hat is introduced and breaks out into song. We only ever get 3 total sorting songs in this entire series. We get the one here in Book 1, one in Book 4, and one in Book 5. And this one is the most basic out of all of them, as it only very briefly explains what each house is looking for in their students. He says that bravery will go to Gryffindor, ambition will go to Slytherin, wisdom will go to Ravenclaw, and those who parlay in fairness will go to Hufflepuff. This McGonagall tells the first years that each of them will try on the hat, which will sort them into their house. We know that the sorting hat is one of the very few relics of the founders, in that it belonged to Godric Gryffindor. And I do find it odd that Voldemort never at least tried to turn the sorting hat into a Horcrux because of that. It could be that just like Gryffindor's sword, he never got an opportunity to get his hands on it, or it could be the fact that the sorting hat can talk, spends a lot of time with Dumbledore. Probably not a very good idea to put your soul into. I don't know. I would have liked there to be like one line in book 6 about it, but we don't. But it's still fun. The sorting begins, and we actually get a relatively comprehensive list of people in Harry's year. We get the Patel twins, Dean Thomas, Seamus Finnegan, Neville Longbottom, etc. It is interesting to note that Harry's year only has 40 students. If you divide that by 4, that means only about 10 students per house exist. And if you can assume that each a year is about the same size, that means at maximum Hogwarts only houses about 300 students. Now, there's a very common theory that this is most likely because everyone at this point that is attending Hogwarts, their parents were all, young adults during Voldemort's first reign, so most of them were either dead, cowering in fear, or fighting back against Voldemort, and they were too busy doing all of that in order to have children. I do like this idea just because it's a very subtle way of showing how terrible Voldemort's reign really was. Now, little by little, the first years are sorted into their houses. Prominently, we have Hermione going into Gryffindor and Malfoy into Slytherin. And then it's Harry's turn. The entire Great Hall falls into whispers because they're all very anxious and wondrous about where the famous Harry Potter will go to. Even a lot of the teachers are very curious. We know that Dumbledore and Snape in particular were very curious about this because while it isn't necessarily true that all Slytherins are evil, it's a pretty good indication at this point in the series. But thus, Harry's sorting begins. Difficult. Very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent. Oh, my goodness, yes. And a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. So, where shall I put you? Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, eh? Are you sure? You could be great, It's all here in your head. And Slytherin will help you on your way to greatness, no doubt about that. No? Well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor. It's so iconic, I had to read it line for line. Harry being put into Gryffindor at this point in the story kind of cements him as the good guy if we didn't already know that. Like I just said, being in Slytherin doesn't make you a bad person, but in this point in the series, you have your Malfoys and your Voldemorts in Slytherin, and you have your Dumbledores in Gryffindor. It's pretty 1-for-1 on that ratio right now. Harry goes to take his seat with the other Gryffindors, who, by the way, basically destroyed the entire Great Hall in their applause because the famous Harry Potter was now a part of them. Harry takes his seat and is very shortly joined by Ron, who obviously also gets sorted in to Gryffindor. I do want to point out that yes, Harry could have very easily have gone into Slytherin. And this could be because there is a piece of Voldemort's soul attached to his own that the Sorting Hat was looking at. But on the other hand, I also think that Harry does embody a lot of Slytherin traits. Look at every single plan that Harry manages to pull off just based on the pure grit of his cunning through the entire series. Even Dumbledore says that Harry embodies a lot of traits that Salazar Slytherin valued. But it is here that we get one of the most prominent themes in the entire series, in that it is your choices much more than your circumstances that dictate who you are. Yes, Harry could very easily have gone into Slytherin, but he asked not to. And I think that's really beautiful, and we get that through the entire series. Most prominently in Chamber of Secrets, where it's very explicitly said. And if you look at Voldemort with the prophecy, he allows the prophecy to take away any choice he has in who he brands as the one who will take him down. And he puts so much stock in the prophecy that it becomes a self-fulfilling one at some point. But all that aside, the feast begins with Dumbledore standing up and saying, "Nitwit, blubber, oddment. Tweak." Harry wonders if Dumbledore is actually a little crazy, and he kind of is, but that's beside the point. Harry doesn't have a whole lot of time to really dwell on this because the feast begins, and here we get our very first feast at Hogwarts. The food in this series is equally a character a lot of the times, just as much as anything else. A lot of fantasy and fiction uses this motive of food porn for lack of a better term, to establish how happy or how sad we should feel as the audience. We feel safe at Hogwarts because there's a feast at every major holiday, and even when there isn't a major holiday going on, all of us are very well fed. And by contrast to that, during book 7, when the trio is on the run, they have a very substantial lack of food, meaning that they're very scared, very hungry, and very anxious the entire time, making us, the audience, feel the same way. Food is a very good way, a very common denominator between every member in the world, so it's very smart of JK to use that here. During the feast, we get a lot of great things going on, a lot of staples that we can talk about. For example, Seamus Finnegan, he says that his mom was a witch and his dad was a muggle. But his mom did not tell his dad about the magic until after they were married. Now, this establishes the idea of half-bloods and everything. But if you want to look into it a little bit more, this is very similar to Snape's upbringing in that Eileen Prince did not tell Tobias Snape about magic until after Severus was born. We also get a lot more ghost stuff here. We get the great gag of nearly headless Nick being nearly headless, which I don't know how JK come up with that, but it's brilliant. And we also get the Bloody Baron, which he has mentioned here for the first time, and really one of the very few times throughout the entire series. Now, nearly headless Nick says he doesn't know why the Bloody Baron is Baron, but we know on reread that the reason is because he had gutted himself in remorse for his murder of Helena Ravenclaw. Which, by the way, if you're a first-time reader and you just heard that sentence, that must have been wild. This book series gets so dark. Also, we get our very first moment of Snape being a villain counter, where J.K. tries to make us all think that Severus Snape is the villain. We get this here because Harry looks up at the staff table and he looks at Snape, who is talking to Quirrell, and his scar prickles. Now, on first read, you're supposed to wonder why this interaction is happening. But on reread, the reason we know this is happening is because Harry is actually looking at the back of Quirrell's head, where Voldemort currently is. We know at this point in the book, Quirrell is being possessed by Voldemort. After the events of July 31st, where Quirrell had failed to get the stone from Gringotts, Voldemort had decided that Quirrell working independently was probably not a good idea anymore. I really wish that there was some mention throughout this book of Quirrell being very ill. Now, we do see instances of Harry saying that he looks pale or scared, but I really wish there was some mention of him going to the hospital wing or something to that effect. I want that due to the fact that Voldemort will later say that when he possesses snakes and other wildlife, they die very quickly. And yes, Quirrell is a more complex creature, but I really wish there was more evidence of that happening. We know that Quirrell dies at the end of this book, but we don't know if it's a result of the damage that Harry manages to pull off against him, or if it was the act of Voldemort leaving Quirrell's body that killed him. But after the feast is concluded, Dumbledore stands up and gives his official start-of-term announcements. And these are basically just rules that Harry will break at some point in this book. 1, he says, the Black Forest at the edge of the grounds is forbidden to all students due to the fact that there is a variety of magical creatures inside of it. 2, he says that magic is forbidden inside the corridors. 3, second years and above may attend tryouts when Madam Hooch, who is the head of Quidditch, announces the tryout dates. And 4, there is a new rule where students are banned from the right-hand side, third floor corridor, for all those who do not wish to die painfully. Now, this is obviously because this is where Dumbledore is stashing the stone. And I do find it very odd that Dumbledore decided to put the stone in a very accessible area. Like, this is because of the plot and the mystery. We had to have a reason for Harry to be able to get to the stone also. But putting the stone inside the Mirror of Erised and then locking the mirror inside of Dumbledore's office would have been way better of a defense. Or even not even going that far. He could have just put the stone inside of his office. Quirrell is a very mediocre wizard, at least in comparison to Voldemort and Dumbledore, and there's no way he could have beaten Dumbledore to get to the stone. Like I said, plot, mystery, blah, blah, blah. But I do wish that the plot would have accounted for that a little bit more. But after these announcements are made, the students are released to their dormitories. Now, I'm not going to mention the house song. It never comes up again. And lines like Hoggy Warty Hogwarts, it kills me inside, but we're going to move past that. Peeves gets introduced here. Peeves is as old as Hogwarts itself. due to the fact that the poltergeist was created by the raw, magical, chaotic energy of having such a large group of magical students in one place at one time. The Gryffindor first years follow Percy Weasley up to the Gryffindor common room, where we are introduced to the Fat Lady, who, by the way, has like the worst nickname in this entire series. Like, what did she do to deserve that? Well, anyway, we're introduced to the concept of passwords to get into the Gryffindor common room. At this point, the password is simply Caput Dragonus, which I'm pretty sure just means dragon's butt. But later on in the books, J.K. Rowling will use this concept in order to give us hints into her storytelling for that mystery of that book. Harry goes right off the bed here, where he has a very bad dream. He sees that Professor Quirrell's turban, which on reread we know to actually just be Voldemort, is telling him to go into Slytherin. And then he sees Malfoy, who turns into Snape, and then Snape turns into a high cold voice, and then he wakes up when he sees a flash of green light. However, come morning, he does not remember this dream, either fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it.
Hey, listen, asshole. Listen, you son of a bitch. What the fuck's your problem? You get in my face with that, I'll beat your goddamn ass, you son of a bitch. You piece of shit. You fucking goddamn fucker. Listen, fuckhead, you have fucking crossed the line. Get that through your goddamn fucking head. Stop pushing your shit.
But thus we enter into Chapter 8, The Potions Master. In this chapter, we get the day-to-day life of Hogwarts. A lot of people complain, myself included, that they wish we had more in-classroom interaction in these books. And that's mainly just because we all want to feel like we're also getting the magical education. But we actually do get a pretty good curriculum here for the first years. For example, we know that Charms is taught by Professor Flitwick, Herbology is taught by Professor Sprout, Transfiguration is taught by Professor McGonagall, Potions is taught by Professor Snape, Defense Against the Dark Arts is taught by Professor Quirrell, and Astronomy is never given a listed professor, but from Prisoner of Azkaban and also Pottermore, we know it to be Professor Sinistra. I do find it a very good piece of educational foundation that all 4 heads of houses teach core classes that every student is mandated to take for at least the first 5 years of their schooling. As the heads of houses, they act in a secondary role as an advisor to their house population, and this makes sense as it establishes a relationship between the student body and the teacher. We'll spend plenty of time in these classes in the next 7 years, so I won't dwell on what each one is, but primarily on display here we have Quirrell. Quirrell's classes are all very theoretical, it seems like, and later Umbridge will say that Quirrell was the only professor in the 4 years leading up to her taking the position that abided by ministry-approved curriculum. However, just take a moment to give a good laugh in the concept that this is the closest that Lord Voldemort ever gets his dream job of being a professor at Hogwarts. Like, do you think that Voldemort ever just stayed up late with Quirrell helping him write lesson plans? Because, like, it's his dream job, and this is the only opportunity he's ever going to get at it. So do you think he was like, yes, Quirrell, and the 6 years are falling behind on their understanding of curses. Make sure you double down on that next week. It might come up in their notes. Like, Quirrell must be annoyed as hell at some point in this school year. But, of course, the highlight of this chapter is Snape. The Gryffindor first years attend their very first lesson in the dungeons. Now, a lot of people say that Snape, he has 2 main faults in being a teacher. And that is he bullies his students, and his method of teaching usually boils down to just follow the instructions on the board. However, I think in this chapter you see that Snape actually does have a very good presence in the classroom. Even though he does do it by bullying Harry, he does teach the students valuable things like the ingredients to the Drought of Living Death and what a Bezoar is, both of which are Newt level ideas in curriculum. I subscribe to the theory that a lot of the reason that so many of the students have a difficult time in potion class, but all of the students manage to pass their OWLs with at least an A, is due to the fact that Snape purposely assigns them coursework that would be above their year. And there is some evidence for that. For example, like I just said, all of the students, at the very least, pass potions with at least an A. And when Umbridge is reviewing Snape's teaching in Book 5, she says that the class is fairly advanced for their year, and I'm going to assume that that fact stands strong for every year. But yes, the major reason that Snape gets his reputation is because he bullies the Gryffindors pretty roughly. He completely sideswipes Harry by asking him questions that no one could reasonably expect Harry to know, And he takes a point away when Harry rightfully says that Hermione clearly knows the answers and should be asked instead. Which, okay, maybe you could argue the fact that Harry was being sarcastic and Snape simply doesn't put up with such things. But he also takes a point away when Neville melts Seamus's cauldron, and Snape says that Harry purposely didn't help Neville just to make himself look better. Which, by the way, isn't it really cute that they only take like 1 point away here and there at the very beginning of the series? Yet in book 2, Harry and Ron get like 200 points each. It's so nice. But yeah, this is all supposed to establish the fact that Snape is one of the worst characters ever, or at least at this point, one of the worst characters ever. And it's also supposed to further the audience into believing that he is a villain. But, so the final part of this chapter revolves around Harry and Ron visiting Hagrid. After Hagrid berates Filch and Mrs. Norris, who all the students hate, Harry asks Hagrid why Snape hates him so much. Hagrid shrugs this idea off, but Harry notices that Hagrid won't meet his eye. I really question what Hagrid actually knows about the Snape-James relationship. Hagrid would have been groundskeeper during the Marauder era of Hogwarts, so it's possible that he would have been present for some of the bullying that James did to Snape. But at the same time, come book 3, when Hagrid talks about James, he doesn't really talk about him like that, so that's a little weird. And also, Snape was never an official member of the Order of the Phoenix during the First War, at least to the extent where other members of the Order knew about him working for Dumbledore, so I doubt it came from that. It's interesting, I don't know. Then Harry manages to sneak a peek at the Daily Prophet of the day, and notices that the vault that had been broken into was actually robbed on July 31st, the same day that Harry went to Gringotts with Hagrid. Harry rightfully deduces that Vault 713 is the most probable target, as it meets all the criteria of the article. Hagrid doesn't respond to this theory, but Harry wonders what was so important that was being kept in the vault that someone would try to break into Gringotts for. And for that matter, he also wonders, what did Hagrid know about Snape hating Harry? The final chapter that we'll be covering today is the Midnight Duel. This chapter begins with Harry establishing the fact with the audience that Draco Malfoy is the worst person ever. Draco simply loves making the Gryffindors, and especially Harry's, life as miserable as possible. At the top of this chapter, he accomplishes this by bragging at length about how good of a broom rider he is in anticipation for the first year's first broom riding lesson. In fairness, though, Malfoy was not the only one who liked to pump up his reputation for this. Ron was also trying to pump up his reputation, as well as pretty much every other student who was raised in the Wizarding world. Muggleborns, like Hermione especially, was using this time to quote Quidditch to the Ages to help with her nerves. All of this was just to point out the fact that Harry was again feeling like the odd man out. Now, Neville also, at this point, gets a letter in the mail from his grandma that contains a Remembrall. This magical object is actually pretty nifty. The magic of the ball manages to tell the user that they've forgotten something by glowing red. I can only imagine that the way it accomplishes this task is by using a very minor memory charm to determine if the person holding it is forgetting something. However, in common everyday circumstances, the object isn't very useful, since most people have forgotten something at some point. Like, what if you were just holding the Remembrall and you repress something very traumatic and it glows red, and you just try to remember and remember until you pull up that repressed memory? It's pretty awful. But in fairness, the Remembrall is extremely useful for like exams because you're focusing on one in particular subject. But they're also banned from most Hogwarts examinations, so I think Neville's grand was just messing with him or something. I don't know if J.K. had really planned out Neville's entire back history yet. We know that by book 4 she obviously had, but I don't know if she had gone into book 1 with the idea that Neville's parents would be mentally, incoherent, or if she went back to book 1 when she was writing book 4 to establish that. The first years go down to the very first flying lesson, and almost immediately Neville manages to break his wrist by falling nearly 20 feet off his broom. This forces the broomstick instructor, Madam Hooch, who, by the way, Madam Hooch has like the best job at Hogwarts. She teaches like one lesson a year to the first years, and then the rest of her job is just like building the bracket for the Quidditch Cup at Hogwarts. It's very cake. But this forces her to abandon the class in order to take Neville up to the hospital wing. Malfoy, at this point, had managed to swipe Neville's Remembrall because Neville had dropped it when he fell off his broom. Harry, being Harry, wanted to help out his housemate and demands it back. Thus, Harry and Malfoy race off on their brooms, and Harry gets his first taste of his favorite thing in the wizarding world. He wasn't just good at being on a broomstick, he was comfortable, he was free, and he was no longer the odd man out. And that's why, at the beginning of this chapter, we established the fact that he felt that way, so we could contrast this moment, and I really do love that. Now, at this point, I wonder if the Remembrall became scarlet when Malfoy was holding it, because Malfoy had clearly forgotten that his enemy here was Harry James Potter on a broomstick, and no one beats Harry James Potter on a broomstick. Malfoy chucks the ball, and Harry manages to catch it, despite the fact that it was falling nearly 70 feet in the air. His class cheers, but unfortunately, Professor McGonagall is also here and saw everything. She had seen Harry's activities, and she's going to beat Harry to death. Yeah, this is actually where the book ends. Yeah, she's going to kill Harry by beating him with her fists. Although she also seems to realize that her arms would get tired because she asked Professor Quirrell for a piece of wood to hit him with, just in case, But no, of course, wood is, in this case, not a tool to beat students to death with, but rather another student. Harry, McGonagall says, is going to be the new seeker for the Gryffindor Quidditch team. McGonagall and Wood are rock hard, phrasing, for Quidditch, and Wood says Harry will get caught up on the rules and then join regular team practices. McGonagall has a very sweet moment here, and when I was reading this again, I said "aw" out loud. She tells him, "Your father would have been proud. He was a great Quidditch player." And this is the first time Harry is compared to his father, and we don't linger on it too much here, because we'll get a lot more of Harry James comparisons. But just imagine being an orphan and being told for the very first time that your father would have been proud of you. It's just very sweet, and even more so from the fact that it comes from the very stern Professor McGonagall. Malfoy, on the other hand, is not as sweet. He was very not happy with the turn of events. Harry not only avoided punishment, but was now having a standard rule being bent for him in the fact that he could join a Quidditch team as a first year. After some standard back and forth, Malfoy challenges Harry to a duel. Ron accepts on Harry's behalf because Harry doesn't know what a wizard's duel is, but Ron, being the bro that he is, decides that he's going to be Harry's second, and Crabbe decides that he's going to be Malfoy's, or rather Malfoy decides Crabbe's going to be. And they agree to meet in the trophy room at midnight for their fight. Harry has no idea what a wizard combat really looks like yet, but Ron says that it doesn't really matter because Malfoy and Harry are both really too inexperienced to really do anything, and if all else fails, just punch him in the face and call it a good night. It should be noted, though, that I think that Ron and Harry are being very Gryffindor here. Malfoy never had any intention of showing up to the duel, and really, he only ever wanted to get the two boys in trouble, yet Harry and Ron never focus on that possibility. I do love their hard-headedness a lot of the times, but this shows exactly why they need Hermione in the trio. In any case, the boys sneak downstairs at 11:30 and try to head out towards the trophy room. But our bushy-haired angel is also in the common room when the boys come downstairs. Hermione had been present through all of Chapter 8 and now Chapter 9, trying to keep the boys out of trouble so that they wouldn't lose Gryffindor any more house points. She had overheard the conversation with Malfoy and was pretty adamant in stopping the two of them. However, Ron and Harry are pretty stubborn and they decide to leave anyway, so Hermione follows them out. Outside the portrait hole, they also run into Neville, who had actually just forgotten the password after he came back from the hospital wing after getting his wrist repaired. Now, officially running out of time, though, Ron and Harry decide the best course of action is to let Neville and Hermione come with them. They run off to the trophy room, and, like I said, Malfoy never had any intention of actually showing up. He had actually tipped off Filch and Mrs. Norris that there would be two students out of bed and wanted to get them in trouble. The caretaker and the cat show up almost immediately after the four of them do, thus the four of them try to hide. Fun fact, the trophy room actually moves between the 3rd floor and the 6th floor depending on its mood. And by pure happenstance, the trophy room had materialized on the 3rd floor this night. Despite Peeves being both a hindrance and a blessing since the poltergeist both outed them and also hid them from Filch, they still managed to get cornered on the 3rd floor thanks to a locked door. Hermione uses our first name spell in the series that doesn't attempt to turn Peter Pettigrew yellow, Alohomora. This unlocks the door, which, by the way, why did Dumbledore not lock this door with magic to prevent students from getting inside? I mean, yeah, Fluffy was Hagrid's protection from the stone, but, Dumbledore, lock a door. Like, it's not that hard. You're making this way too easy. Irregardless, the four of them rush in, and they step out of the frying pan and into the fire, because here they have a run-in with a massive three-headed dog. The four students scream and run back up through the door, up 4 floors, and rush back into the common room. Here, Hermione shows how useful of an ally she actually is. The other three were absolutely just terrified of the dog and openly questioned why they would just put one in the school. But she rightfully points out that the dog is obviously guarding something. There was a trap door underneath the dog also, as she had noticed. She's just brilliant. We love Hermione. The four go to bed, Neville scared, Hermione annoyed, and Ron irritated. Harry, however, manages to put 2 and 2 together. Whatever was in Vault 713 that Hagrid had taken from Gringotts was now being stored at Hogwarts, being guarded by a massive dog. Guys, I love these chapters. Unlike last episode when I was feeling a little bit meh about waiting to get to school, being at Hogwarts for the very first time is the best. A lot can be said about Hogwarts, from its history to its placement in our story, but irregardless of what you discuss, there is only one definitive fact. Hogwarts is our home. We establish our favorite characters in these chapters, from the Weasleys to Hermione, McGonagall, Malfoy, Snape, Dumbledore. It's all so comfortable. Getting to classes also makes us, the audience, feel like we're getting a magical education, which only this series has ever really been able to do. Not only all of that, our mystery into the Sorcerer's Stone deepens. On first read, what we know at this point is the vault in question has been broken into, and was the same vault that Hagrid had emptied, and now that content of that vault is being housed at Hogwarts, being guarded by a dog. On reread, we know that the stone is being kept by Dumbledore for his friend Nicholas Flamel, and the stone is actually being protected by multiple magical defenses. And honestly, the plot of the stone isn't the best, and we can pick plot holes in it all day, and there's a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to the protection of the stone. But honestly, in Book 1, and in my opinion, the stone plot line is more circled around the school instead of the other way around. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Next time, we will be discussing chapters 10, 11, and 12, where we will actually be discussing my favorite chapter in this book, that being the Mirror of Erised. I really hope you can join me for that next time on the Nerdscape.